Hi, today I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 9, which is called Sister Cities. And it is where Esther ends up learning more about the history of Opul's sister city, which is Hungerford, England. And she reads a bunch of their newspapers and gets kind of fascinated by what's going on over there. And then becomes weirdly aware of some of the stuff that's also going on in the US at the time. Meanwhile, her son Bruce has been making a lot of money. Previously, he sold pornography on the playground and had a fair amount of cash from that. And then he transitions to downloading pirated software through bulletin boards and sells those and ends up with a decent chunk of cash, which he decides it'd be a great idea to buy some guns. And so ultimately, what ends up happening is he finds a kid named Gary who has some guns that he's willing to sell. And they do the exchange in the most natural place for sixth or seventh graders, the school bus. And so, anyway, this is that little section here. Um, Gary slid the bag into the walkway and to Bruce's waiting hands. Bruce opened it and felt the weight of each of the pistols in his hands again. They were so heavy, but the weight felt good. He felt powerful. He passed the 357 to Dave, who was sitting next to him, and then removed the shotgun from the bag. Bruce stood up, pressed the stock onto his shoulder, and leveled the gun. He mimed shooting things out the window and then swung it around again in order to sit down. Unfortunately for Bruce, the bus driver suddenly caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of a person holding a shotgun and slammed on the brakes. Bruce smashed into the seat in front of him, and the shotgun fell from his hands and onto the heads of the people in front of him. Everyone was surprised by the sudden stop and more surprised by the falling weapon. "What the hell is going on?" asked the bus driver. The bus had barely come to a complete stop, and he was already halfway to Bruce's seat. "What?" asked Bruce, somewhat lamely. "You can't bring guns on the bus," said the bus driver. "They're not mine," said Bruce. "They're Gary's," as if that made it any better. Gary tried to defend himself. "They're not loaded. We weren't going to hurt anyone. He was just thinking about buying them from me. That's all." "You've got to be kidding me," said the bus driver. "An arms deal on my bus? I don't even allow chewing gum or eating food." The bus driver took the duffel bag, put the guns away, and then returned to his seat at the front of the bus. "You two," he pointed at Gary and Bruce, "do not get off the bus. We're going back to the office after we drop everyone else off." It was a long and quiet bus ride. Typically, Bruce's house was one of the first stops on the way home, but today he got to see the full route. Finally, it was just the bus driver, Gary, and Bruce. They pulled into the front of the school and walked straight to the office. The bus driver explained what had happened and then left. Cheryl Duncan, the office secretary, called Gary's and Bruce's parents, and they waited for the parents to arrive. Gary's father came first. He was shaking his head as he entered the office and greeted his son with a smack to the head. "What were you thinking?" he asked. Gary had no answer. Jeffrey arrived a short time later. Rather than smacking his son, he walked in quietly and sat next to his son without saying a word. "Thank you both for coming," Cheryl said, when she noticed Jeffrey had arrived. "Principal Graham will see you now." Bruce had never been to the principal's office before, let alone the high school principal's office. He had no idea what would happen. He understood with greater clarity that the bus was not the ideal location to buy guns, but he also thought everyone else was overreacting. The guns weren't loaded, and Gary hadn't even brought any ammunition. At least he thought Gary hadn't. Even if he had, what'd the school think they'd do? Shoot up the bus? Who'd want to do that? Gary and Bruce sat quietly as the adults spoke, but neither was engaged in the conversation. The principal was saying, "This is a very serious matter," and the fathers were nodding and agreeing. Both boys knew the real conversation would occur at home, away from the mandated reporters. Now the principal was saying, "No, there was no need to confiscate the weapons or report this to the police." Gary's father was asking about possible suspension. "We'll have to review the case, but I don't know that expulsion can be avoided." Gary's father was particularly animated about that response and began to raise his voice. "Nothing has been decided." Pause. "We'll definitely be in touch." They were escorted out of the office, and each father and son went their separate ways to their respective vehicles. If Gary had been trying to sell his father's guns, he would have been even more serious shit. As it was, he still had to explain where the pistols came from and why the hell he had taken guns to school. Even without ammunition, you had to know that was a stupid thing to do, right? His father asked him. At the time, Gary hadn't thought it was a stupid thing at all. Kids sold and traded things at school all the time. It was usually candy or gum or school supplies, but the way his father phrased the question, it was obvious that it would be best if Gary accepted fault and didn't put up any resistance. He nodded at the appropriate moments, responded in an apologetic tone, and gave no back talk to any of the criticisms lodged at him about his intelligence or his ability to think critically and know the difference between right or wrong. He would be grounded. His father would take away the shotgun for the foreseeable future, and they would wait to see what the school decided to do with him. If he was to be expelled, then he'd work his ass off to prove himself worthy to return to school and to fill the time, he'd do additional work around the house and find himself a job to see what the real world was like for high school dropouts. Jeffrey said nothing on the way home, and Bruce wasn't sure what to do with the silence. His father wasn't a big talker, but he also wasn't prone to extended silences like this. Bruce's mind raced for something smart to say, which was something he was typically good at, but nothing seemed appropriate. He could apologize again, but what good would a third or fourth apology do? He could attempt to explain, but he couldn't come up with a way to justify his actions now. Before, it made total sense to him. He had money, Gary had a gun. They just wanted to exchange those things. The incident on the bus only happened because Bruce had been following his father's example of making the salesman sweat. Earlier in the book, um, Jeffrey walks his son through, dealing with the auto car sale, and Bruce is taking careful notes about how to do that. But Bruce knew it was a bad idea to place the blame on his father. He could imagine how that conversation would go, and he wouldn't come out ahead. The Plymouth Voyager turned into their driveway. Jeffrey got out, closed the door gently, and went inside the house without waiting for his son. Bruce gathered his things and followed. He could hear raised voices as he opened the front door. Inside, his parents were standing on either side of the kitchen counter. Their conversation ended, and their heads turned in unison to look at their son. Then they looked at one another and began anew. Bruce put his backpack down and walked to the kitchen. He stood there, waiting for his punishment. Jeffrey was catching Esther up to speed. Esther was alternating between expressing her shock and rage and peppering her husband with questions. Bruce's head swam, and he faded in and out of their conversation. Finally, his father said something that caught his ear. "I want to know where the hell he got that kind of money." There was a brief pause, and then both adult heads turned to look at the child. "Well?" asked Esther. Bruce didn't answer fast enough for them, and Jeffrey filled in a possible answer with a question of his own. "Is it drugs?" "No," said Esther. "It isn't drugs, is it?" Compared to drugs, selling pirated computer software and pornography didn't seem that bad. Maybe if he let his parents go on long enough, they'd invent more worst-case scenarios and ultimately be less upset about what he had actually done. "Why else would he need protection?" asked Jeffrey. "You're dealing drugs?" asked Esther. "That's even worse than actually using them." "Actually," said Jeffrey, "I'd rather he dealt drugs than used them." "Seriously?" asked Esther. "Who was this man?" "Well, I'd rather see him be a businessman than a junkie." Esther had to admit that was a decent point, but she didn't like the idea of her son being the source of so many other people's downfall. Yes, it was better than being a junkie, but not by much. At least as a junkie, Bruce could get help and be reformed. He was the one being taken advantage of, not the one taking advantage of others. "I'm not doing drugs or selling them," Bruce said. Well, thought Esther and Jeffrey, that was a relief. "Then why the guns?" asked Jeffrey. "Because guns are cool," said Bruce. Um, yeah, I'll stop there. But thanks so much. Thanks for listening and reading. Have a great day.